Hi, I'm Jana Arbanis, and I lead the telecom, media, and entertainment industry sector at Deloitte. Digital platform companies are everywhere. These platforms connect individuals to one another and individuals to businesses. And they've really changed the way that we do things. It's changed the way I've reconnected with high school friends or found a vacation home to rent, send money to one another, and even how we find a date. And really, digital platform companies are unique because they make things much more easy for us. We have digital identities, and they make really great recommendations based on those preferences and connect us to people and services and products that we might not have known about otherwise. And because of the power of these digital platforms, many companies are incorporating a digital platform to get closer to their customers and engage with their customers in different ways. And that's creating new business models and has significant implications on individuals, organizations, taxes. And so today I'm joined by two tax leaders, Ronnie Dasson and Tom Dong, and we're going to talk about the implications of taxes for digital platform companies and those companies that are seeking to incorporate digital platforms into their business models. So maybe we'll start with one of the easy ones. We'll talk about some entertainment. All of us probably have a number of streaming media services that we're paying for. Let's talk a little bit about the implications from a tax perspective for streaming media companies and providing that entertainment service.
These streaming services are, obviously tremendously complex from a tax perspective, because a lot of times what we find is that the services that we purchase today, they weren't around when the tax legislation was written. So, many times we're finding ourselves in a position where, we're trying to, fit a square peg into a round hole, if you will, and trying to find interpretations of existing legislation, to ensure that we get to the right tax treatment. What that does is it causes a lot of uncertainty in the industry.
So what about from your perspective, Tom?
Sure. Yeah. So from corporate tax perspective, having the right ERP set up, a right ERP system is critical, because there are a lot of requirements from the government around the world looking for real-time data and being able to report, doing the tax reporting in real time. And that's kind of the expectation from a lot of places around the world. Understanding who your customers are, knowing the jurisdiction, being able to determine the right tax rate, right tax jurisdiction, and even domestically from sourcing standpoint for multi-state.
What I'm hearing from an industry perspective is that streamers are looking to kind of diversify the way in which they're engaging with their customers and perhaps bundling services together, whether it's entertainment, gaming, music, maybe bringing those things together under one company umbrella, or even from an ecosystem play perspective. So how does that sort of bundling introduce additional complexity?
What you typically find is that the indirect tax legislation around the world, it doesn't, most of the time at least, specifically address how bundled services or bundled products, I should say, how they are to be treated. So what you often see is that this concept is being worked out in additional tax authority guidance, Ministry of Finance guidance, or even case law.
Each different type of revenue stream is going to have a different tax treatment, right? And then take that times however many countries around the world. So each country has its own set of rules on revenue recognition for tax reporting purposes. So when you're bundling services, that becomes extremely difficult for taxing authority to understand the nature of each activity and how to tax each of the revenue streams.
Digital platforms are really just becoming more and more common, even in other industries, right? Certainly, as I mentioned, it's not often anymore that we call a hotel to book a room, right? We're often looking at different digital platforms to help us find a place we want to stay on vacation. So let's talk a little bit about kind of outside of entertainment, like travel, hospitality. What are the additional complexities those industries are facing when they're looking to leverage a digital platform?
What we see is really that they have to combine, these uncertainties in the legislation around digital platforms with their conventional business models, right? And so the two start to intertwine. They've got, oftentimes also, tangible products where there's a really clear, indirect tax treatment in a jurisdiction that now that same product or service gets provided to a customer through a digital platform, and all of a sudden that introduces a complete new dynamic that could result in a completely different tax treatment for that product. I can give an example. Maybe not entirely hotel related, but as it relates to books, for instance, years ago, we would only have paper books. Then, in recent years, we were able to buy that same book on a digital platform. The purpose of us buying that book hasn't changed. We still want the story, that content, right, and read what is in it. But nonetheless, indirect tax legislation, it provided a completely different, tax treatment for the two, which is bonkers, quite honestly, right? It shouldn't be different. So that's what we see, in the world of, those more traditional companies. They struggle with making that work.
Since Ronnie used the example of books, I'll continue to use the same book. The same information is stored on the cloud somewhere, a digital platform. And you may have a US customer, or you may have a non-US customer. And the issue there is if there's a payment coming from a non-US customer, there's always a question of whether or not that's a licensing payment or is that a sale of a copyright product. And there's a lot of withholding tax issues associated with it. So again, is understanding where the data come from and the nature of the activity.
So what are some companies that you're working with doing to kind of advance the infrastructure and support, what those tax requirements are?
Typically what happens is a tax professional within an organization, the person, he or she needs to work closely with an engineering group. Because when the product gets pushed out to customers, they want to make sure every single requirement that tax needs gets incorporated in the portal or as a part of the process.
And so what I see with a lot of my clients that operate digital platforms is they've got a lot of in-house technology in the tax space that they've developed to capture all that data that Tom was referring to, and to make sure that they, can capture, IP addresses, credit card locations, issuing bank, and those types of things, because that's what's needed to come to the right indirect tax treatment. Moreover, and oftentimes there's a lot of competing, types of information. These companies operate in a global landscape, right? So, not only they need to gather that data, but they also need to validate it and, rule out discrepancies in that data and then make decisions on, what can be relied upon.
Maybe talk a little bit about, your experience with companies and how they're able to sort of move closer to the engineering group.
Engineers moves very fast, and tax rules are very different. Every country has its own set of tax rules, and in fact, in the U.S., every state has its own set of tax rules, right? Whether it's indirect tax or corporate tax or individual tax. So I think that the key there is tax needs to be viewed as a value-added team member, not a Dr. No, right? So understanding the business requirement, prioritize what's critical for tax as opposed to items or things that you may have some time to work on. To be able to be a value-added team member, and be able to identify critical matters in the real time. It's always more expensive to try to go back and try to fix the system as opposed to try to just do it right the first time around. So.
Any other advice from you, Ronnie, relative to tax professionals and ensuring that they're able to get a seat at the table early?
They really need to be thinking along the lines of how does tax or indirect tax impact customer experience ultimately? Just to give you an example, if you get invoices wrong, or you do it one way for the first transaction but a different way the second transaction, that's going to lead to questions from customers. They're going to address that. They're going to see what you're doing on the tax front. So there's a lot of reputational consideration that goes into this aspect. If there's anything I can tell CFOs in this respect is they got to ensure that that they have the right indirect tax professionals who are really in tune with the business and understand business objectives and how the technology impacts that, because ultimately tax needs to be embedded and part of it.
Are there steps that they can be taking now to kind of bring their organization along the journey and get closer to what we presume future regulation will look like?
Looking at the technology and working with them to understand, how the technology intertwines with the business and what it needs to do, trying to get to positions that are, as much as possible standardized, consistent, but also implementable, if that's a word. For companies to be able to really, implement those strategies.
So we talked about the challenges that tax professionals are facing because they're interpreting tax regulation. How does that shake out then in terms of a tax audit if you're actually having to justify why you interpreted regulation as you did?
So historically, what we've seen is that, taxing authorities have had a need to heavily rely on data provided by, a taxpayer, the digital platforms, right? What I think is a tremendously important development that, we probably haven't touched on yet is, the increasing amount of digital reporting rules that are being adopted across the world. And when I say digital reporting, I'm referring to things like SAFT in the indirect tax space, or DAC 7 digital reporting for platform companies specifically. Many governments around the world, follow those standards or implement their own rules, whether it's an electronic reporting requirement where you need to electronically report on a near real-time basis, relevant transaction data that puts the tax authorities in a position to almost real-time audit you, for that matter, right? The taxing authorities are going to have such a tremendously big amount of data available based on all these new reporting obligations that, a digital platform needs to be able to proactively understand what data it is sending to the taxing authorities so that it can actually itself, substantiate its tax position and its tax returns that it, in most cases, still has to submit today. That reconciliation is a tremendously big thing.
Very, very similarly, in the corporate world where we already have a country-by-country reporting. What that simply means is every company has to know where the revenue is generated, what are the expenses that reporting each of the countries, and be able to reconcile to some of the publicly available information. And to add on to that, and there's a pillar 2, potentially even on the tax expense, has to be reconciled on a country-by-country basis. And there's a minimum tax around the world. So yeah, having that data, having the right, not just the data, but the right process to process that data to make sure the reporting on the tax form, on those country-by-country reporting forms are appropriately classified. And those are critical for future success.
But let's talk a little bit about the M&A landscape and how companies should be thinking about, due diligence around these mergers and acquisitions and these resulting tax implications.
They focus on, a couple of things, really to identify on a country-by-country basis, what the indirect tax treatment applied is, for all the legal entities involved in, making such cross-border sales or in-country sales for that matter. Really understanding what those transactions are, what the VAT or indirect tax treatment is that it was applied to those transactions, and whether the company has the data to substantiate the positions that it took.
Outside of that, I also think some of the withholding tax reporting that also tend to be one of those hot button issues. A lot of those younger technology companies, they may not know who their customers are. So that creates a lot of uncertainties when it comes to the withholding tax reporting. And also the state sourcing, understanding where the revenues are generated. And those are pretty common M&A topics that comes up during due diligence.
Another hot topic that is on, I think, a lot of executives' mind is ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Let's spend a little bit of time on how tax departments are enabling companies to bring to life their ESG vision. Again,
go back to the clean data, being able to pull that data and aggregate it, put on be part of the ESG reporting. And I think a lot of companies are still working on that. There's definitely a few of them that are already ahead of the pack. We do see a trend of tax being a very central part of having a transparent governance of a corporate enterprise, right? So a lot of those data that we're talking about here, they're all, sooner or later, they're all going to become a public available data.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing a theme that whether it's entering into a new business model or an M&A or even your ESG strategy, you've got to call your tax professionals early and bring them into the conversation to really explore what the implications and the challenges could be and make sure that you're setting up systems to support the data that's going to be required in that regard. So Tom and Ronnie, we have covered a lot of ground today. If you could give one piece of advice to tax professionals who are either operating in a digital platform company or contemplating incorporating a digital platform into the future of their company.
Tax needs to work closely with the business people and engineer to be part of that team to be able to get the system at the right place.
Thank you both for joining me today, and thanks for having us.